Welcome everyone to another AML Gray Matters broadcast. Today is 18th of October 2023, and we welcome back returning guest Andy Carpenter of OJ Regulatory Consulting in Jersey. So welcome, Andy, and thank you for caving into the demand of the audience that wanted you to come back and tell us more about the travel rule.
Thank you for the invitation to come back.
Yeah, how is life in the Channel Islands today?
It's suddenly got very wintry and cold and wet, so it's nice to be talking to someone in Cayman and thinking of how warm it must be over there.
Yeah, well, Tom's in Cayman. I'm actually wearing a woolly sweater myself. So I do like October. It's my favorite time of year. I like the cold and the crisp air. Hope others do too. So before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. So a reminder that this webinar is not legal advice. It should last about 1 hour. Do you agree, Andy? About an hour?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And everyone is encouraged to post your questions using the question box. The chat box I don't think works for our attendees, but do post your questions. We will be keeping an eye on them, and I will present some of them at the end. We do have a fairly large audience today, so we might, I might not be able to get to all of them, but I do try my best. Certificates of attendance will also be generated. They're auto-generated for the live attendees only of the broadcast. And you will receive those in an email about 1 hour after the broadcast ends. And I've already had a couple of questions about people asking for slides. Yes, you can ask for slides, and I will let you have that information. It'll be in the follow-up email of who you reach out to get a copy of the slides. Otherwise, I get inundated with requests. And also, so Andy and I can get a feel. We're going to have a couple of polling questions so we can get an idea of who's listening in and what your roles are and your involvement with the travel rule and virtual assets. So if you can just please participate with those, and also do stay to the end if you can, because I do have a couple of survey results from a survey I asked the audience a couple of webinars ago about their compliance challenges, and I found the results quite interesting. Also, we have some upcoming events, and I do have some feedback questions for the audience as well. So the first polling question is, do you work at a virtual asset service provider? Because this is mostly going to be related, the rules. It's great that everybody, even if you don't work at a VASP, it's great that you're listening in so you can kind of understand some of the challenges that they are facing. And but if you do work at a VASP, it also helps us kind of get an idea of who in our audience is going to be most impacted. All right, we'll go ahead and close, give it about 10 more seconds. Oh, you've already closed it, that's fine. So yeah, so most of you do not, that's fine. We've only got about 3% of you. If you want to go ahead and share that results, Tom, you're more than welcome to. So yeah, so the majority of you do not, but again, it is very important that we all kind of learn what we're all facing here. And the second question, is your jurisdiction compliant with the FATF's requirement to implement the FATF standards on virtual assets and VASP? Sorry. So there you go. So we're getting some results in. This is great. And let's give those a few more seconds. So Andy, do you think the audience is going to be mostly compliant, largely compliant, non-compliant? What's your guess here?
I would say, knowing some of the stats, I'd say not many are going to be that compliant with the travel rule.
Okay.
But having had some of the stats from a recent paper, I'd say, yeah, not that many are going to be compliant with the travel rule.
Okay. All right. It's interesting. There we go. All right. So they're seeing those results now, and we're seeing 36% aren't sure. That's fair. 38% saying they're compliant, 14% largely compliant, 10% partially compliant, 2% non-compliant. And if we took that 36% and said that they're either probably in the partially or largely or non-compliant, then you're right. It would be the mostly most of our audience probably is not in the fully compliant range. So very good. Yeah, good call, Andy. And one more poll before I kick off with, or let Andy kick off with the topic. And this is going to be, again, just a gauge. Do you know some of the key issues with regarding to the travel rule? So if you can take a moment to either hazard a guess or answer what you think. So we're asking if you know, the sunrise issue, which is something that Andy will be talking about, what's it relate to? All right, so we'll go ahead and yeah, close that one up. And 72% do not know or are unsure. And 18% say it's a particular challenge, 5% it's an exemption, and 6% it's a required delay period. So we are going to find out the answers. I'm not going to spoil the ending for you. Great, thank you very much for participating in that. And so we're going to go ahead and Andy, as before, I'll let you present. If I do have a question, I'll kind of unmute myself and ask my question. But otherwise, I'm going to let you proceed with your flow. Okay, so.
Okay, thank you. So thanks, Kimberly. So yeah, my name is Andy Carpenter. I am a regulatory consultant, senior regulatory consultant at Auger Regulatory Consulting. Auger is itself, it is an international legal and professional services firm with offices in jurisdictions shown here, ranging from Cayman to Tokyo. And Auger Regulatory Consulting itself launched in March in Jersey this year. And we have also got offices both here in Jersey and in Cayman as well. So the services that Auger Regulatory Consulting provide with relation to virtual assets, there's 5 services listed here. We also assist with traditional regulatory consulting for the traditional financial service providers, but with regard to virtual asset service providers, we assist, as part of investigations, we assist with setting up and configuring virtual asset AML controls for any firms looking to have dealings with virtual assets, or are going to have dealings with individuals who approach their firm and virtual assets is their source of wealth or source of funds. Blockchain analytics, we're experienced with setting up and configuring blockchain analytics tools. We've done a previous webinar with yourselves around blockchain analytics and AML controls, and I think that hopefully that presentation is available on the Silo webpage. And some of the things we're going to talk about today, they will have been mentioned previously in a previous webinar. So it may be that after, if this has sort of piqued your interest, that you could go back and have a look at the other webinar if you saw fit. So we also assist with AML compliance, risk reporting and audits. We provide training, both from getting people from 0 to 1, as far as sort of awareness of virtual assets, and we can take training goes all the way through to sort of compliance teams and board level training. And remediation and monitoring as well. We can identify applicable regulatory requirements and able to assist with implementation of recommendations. So that's really with regards to virtual asset service provider services. That's where we focus our efforts. Okay, so with regards to myself, I won't dwell too long on myself. So I've spent 20 years in public sector law enforcement and private sector consultancy firms. As I say, currently a senior regulatory consultant at Auger Regulatory Consulting, specialising in virtual assets and blockchain. And in the UK, before I came over to Jersey, I was classed as an expert witness. And the area of expertise was technology and how technology works. I'd go into to speak to juries in Crown Court trials and explain to them things like mobile phone location tracking, mobile phone data recovery, and present them with relevant case evidence as well. And then when I moved over to Jersey, I joined the Joint Financial Crime Unit as head of digital forensics and virtual assets investigations. And through that, I've seen how virtual assets can be used for criminal purposes and how organised crime groups use and transfer virtual assets, be it for drug payments or using virtual assets in the layering stage of money laundering. So I've seen how sort of without AML controls being put in place, virtual asset service providers can be used to launder stolen funds. Whilst at the Joint Financial Crime Unit, I did my ICA diploma, international diploma in AML, and then went on to Shaw, which is a local telecoms provider, because being a telecoms provider, all the data, internet data and mobile phone handset data runs through telecoms providers, and it gave me a good insight into the technological controls to prevent fraud and to provide suitable reporting mechanisms to prevent money laundering. So then I decided to go from the reactive crime side to the proactive side with Azure Regulatory Consulting, in that we can help companies set up AML controls and prevent them being used as part of money laundering. So that's really my background in a nutshell. So today we're going to talk about the travel rule. As I said earlier, we ran a webinar earlier in the year, which is available, and it talks about using AML controls to reduce risk. And whilst this webinar addresses the travel rule, if you did want to hear more about things like blockchain analytics, AML controls, etc., which we're going to reference in this webinar, then the earlier webinar will go into those subjects in more detail. But today we're going to talk about the travel rule. What is it? How does it relate to virtual assets? Why is it important from an AML perspective? And what are the challenges in implementing the travel rule? And how these challenges can be overcome? It's as Kimberly mentioned, the travel rule was one of the questions in the last webinar, and I have been asked a couple of times since, the travel rule, we've heard about it. Can you explain it to us? And it will take a bit of time to explain. It's not an easy thing to explain, but I'll do my best. I'll give it a crack. Okay. So what is the travel rule? And I think it's best to start off with explaining on the next slide that it's not a new thing. The travel rule itself, the term, the travel rule, goes all the way back to the Bank Secrecy Act, sort of 1996. The Bank Secrecy Act, Rule 31, which was published by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in the United States in this FinCEN advisory we've got on screen. It basically, the travel rule itself required all financial institutions to share certain information with the next financial institution in certain funds transmittals involving more than one financial institution. So effectively, what it's saying is that you needed to, along with the funds that you were transferring, you needed to provide certain information. Under the rule, when a transaction involved a transfer of funds of $3,000 or more, the financial institution must include the following information alongside the transfer of funds: the name and address of the transmitter, the amount of the transaction, the execution date, any payment instructions, and the identity of the financial institution's employee who receives the transaction order. And the rule also required the transmitting financial institution to pass on certain information to the next financial institution, if there is one. So if you've got a chain of financial institutions with these funds running between them, then you needed to have this information, such as name and address, beneficiary information, that needs to go with the actual transmission of funds themselves. And the purpose of this rule was to provide a paper trail for law enforcement agencies to follow in money laundering, terrorism financing, and other financial crime investigations. So that was back in 1996, and that is how the travel rule came about. But now we're going to move on to move forward in time a bit to 2012 and the Financial Action Task Force, which, as you may know, it's an intergovernmental agency, organisation, founded in 1989. And since its creation, FATF has expanded its mandate to include combating the financing of terrorism and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So back in 2012, it published 40 recommendations to establish a comprehensive and consistent framework for combating money laundering and other related threats to the integrity of the international financial system. So FATF monitors countries to ensure they implement these standards fully and effectively, and holds them to account if they fail to do so. So FATF's work is crucial. It should be pointed out, it is a very serious organisation to be listened to, in that its work is crucial in protecting the integrity of global financial systems and contributes to the safety and security worldwide. So of these 14 new recommendations they published in 2012, recommendation 16 was an sort of adoption of that Bank Secrecy Act. So recommendation 16 is known as the travel rule. And it mandates that the countries ensure that financial institutions include required and accurate originator information and required beneficiary information on wire transfers and related messages, and that the information remains with the wire transfer and related message throughout the payment chain. So this was back in 2012, sort of at the very dawn of virtual assets. There's no mention in this original publication of virtual assets themselves. But if we can go on to the next slide, we're going to see how does it relate, the travel rule relate to virtual assets. There's a bit of a timeline here of the evolution of virtual asset FATF standards. So we've spoken about 2012 and the first publication of the 40 standards. Then 2015, there was a guidance for a risk-based approach to virtual currencies published, known as the guidance, and that required originator and beneficiary information. But then the main publication came in 2019. And we're going to just spend a bit of time talking about the 2019 publication. And if you are interested in travel rule, virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, the 2019 guidance is a sort of key document for you to look at. So they published the guidance that clarified the application of its standards to virtual assets and VASP, or virtual asset service providers. Amongst the key points, FATF has emphasised that recommendation 16, also known as the travel rule, applied to virtual asset service providers. That meant that just like traditional financial institutions, VASPs are required to obtain, hold, and transmit certain information about the parties involved in a transaction. Specifically for each transaction, the originating virtual asset service provider is required to obtain and hold accurate and current sender information. So this is the KYC information held by virtual asset service providers. So yeah, that's required to obtain and hold accurate and current sender information, and required beneficiary information, and submit this information to the beneficiary VASP or institution if there is one. So if it's, for example, Binance as a virtual asset service provider sending information to Coinbase, they would somehow, sending funds to Coinbase, which is another virtual asset service provider, they would somehow have to transmit this sort of customer information between each other. And this information should include the names of the sender and recipient, their account numbers, which in the case of virtual asset service providers would be their wallet addresses, their physical addresses, and the transaction details. And FATF stated that it is vital that countries ensure that providers of VA transfers, whether VASPs or other obliged entities, transmit the required originator and beneficiary information immediately and securely when carrying out these transactions. FATF also clarified that the countries should ensure that VASPs are regulated for AML and CFT purposes, and that they are licensed or registered and subject to effective systems for monitoring and ensuring compliance. So FATF really starting to clamp down in 2019 on virtual asset service providers and making sure that they are regulated when it came to money laundering, or sort of prevention of money laundering.
Okay, I have a quick question. Does that guidance in 2019, does it refer to how long they must keep that information?
So FATF's guidance was they should adopt this travel rule as soon as practicable. That was the statement they made. So I think it's a case that they realised that it wasn't a quick fix, and we'll go into why it's not a quick fix to implement the travel rule for virtual asset service providers. So they didn't give a deadline of, say, 2020 or 21. They just said that the virtual asset service providers needed to apply the travel rule as soon as practicable.
Okay, but that's applying it. How long, once they can apply it, how long do they have to keep all the senders and beneficiaries information? So if they were just doing a one-off kind of transaction, do they have to keep it for like 5 years, 10 years?
It is 5 years, yeah, it's 5 years.
It's 5 years, okay.
Yeah, they need to keep the information for. So the 2019 guidance was a big step in regards to the regulation of virtual assets, reflecting, I think it was realised at that point, the growing importance of virtual assets in the global financial system, and also the associated risks of money laundering, terrorist financing involving them. But it also posed significant implementation challenges, which we're going to look at for the virtual assets industry, given the technical difficulties in transmitting information between virtual asset service providers and the privacy concerns raised by the required sharing of personal data. Okay. So in 2023, there was a targeted update published by FATF, targeted update on the implementation of FATF standards on virtual assets and VASP. So they've gone out to industry, asked, and to jurisdictions, asked some questions on how they were getting on. And in 2023, they produced the results of their findings from those questions. So the key findings were that 75% of the 98 jurisdictions remained partially or not compliant with FATF's requirements. Quite a high number, unfortunately, but it is tricky to, there's all these recommendations that FATF have produced, and VASPs have got a big challenge on their hands to adopt the FATF requirements. 34% of the 151 respondents on recommendation 15 implementation have not conducted a risk assessment. So just drifting slightly to recommendation 15. Recommendation 15 states that countries and VASPs should identify and assess the risk of money laundering and terrorist financing associated with virtual assets, including identifying and assessing the risks of new technology and new business practices such as are used in the virtual asset sector. And it was saying that VAS should implement risk-based AML CFT preventative measures. So these are, pretty standard from FATF, stating that you need to get these controls in place in order to prevent money laundering involving virtual assets. Some examples of the risk factors that countries and VAS considered when conducting their risk assessment were likes of the type of customer being served, the geographical location of the customer, the type of virtual asset activity being conducted, because there's a number of different types of virtual assets, the size and volumes of the transactions, and the level of anonymity associated with the virtual asset activity itself. So FATF really, it's not just about the travel rule. FATF were really sort of trying to clamp down and prevent the use of virtual assets being used for money laundering. So 34% had not conducted a risk assessment around virtual assets of the 151 survey respondents. So it's still quite a high amount. And almost the same number had not yet decided if and how to regulate the VASP sector. So this is a recent update. Virtual assets have been around for a while, but yet the jurisdictions have not yet decided how to regulate the virtual assets. The results of the mutual evaluation and follow-up results reports showed that 73% are not conducting adequate risk assessments, and more than 50% have taken no steps towards travel rule implementation. So although travel rule is something that's mentioned quite frequently at the moment, quite topical, 50% of the respondents have taken no steps towards implementing it. And amongst those who have, supervision and enforcement is low, with only 21% having issued findings, directives, or taken enforcement or supervisory action. Okay. So why is it important from an AML perspective? So we've spoken in the previous webinar about sort of blockchain analytics, which is another anti-money laundering tool, but the travel rule helps to prevent money laundering involving virtual assets in the sort of 5 steps here. Enhanced transparency. It requires VASPs to collect and share specific KYC information about the sender and recipient for each transaction, and that increases the transparency of the transactions and makes it harder for individuals to use these assets to launder money anonymously. Traceability. The information collected as part of the travel rule creates a traceable path of individuals involved in the transfer of virtual assets. It's not just about anonymous wallet addresses now at this point. It's about having KYC information attached to the transactions themselves, and allows authorities to track the movement of assets and identify suspicious patterns that could indicate money laundering. The third one is, as it says, it's deterrence, because knowing that transactions are no longer as anonymous as they once were and can be traced might deter potential criminals from using virtual assets for illicit activities such as money laundering. Regulatory oversight. The travel rule provides another data set for financial regulators to analyse, ensuring local VASPs are implementing robust AML, CTF, CPS controls, and that regulatory oversight in itself can help prevent money laundering. And international cooperation. The travel rule facilitates international cooperation in the fight against money laundering by creating a standard set of information that needs to be collected by the VASPs for each transaction and shared. It's easier for authorities in different jurisdictions to work together to investigate and prosecute money laundering, because they know what information VASPs are storing and transmitting between each other. However, it's important to note that implementing the travel rule poses unique challenges, which we're going to go into, due to the decentralized and global nature of many virtual asset transactions. And so we're going to talk about how VASPs and other stakeholders are currently working on solutions to these challenges later. Okay, sorry, I think we've leapt forward a bit there. So why is the travel rule important from an AML perspective? If it didn't exist, it could potentially make it easier for illicit activities to take place. There's a lack of traceability. Without the travel rule, there'd be less transparency and traceability in transactions involving virtual assets. You wouldn't have that key sender and receiver information stored by the VASPs. There'd be regulatory disparity. Without the travel rule, there would be a significant disparity between regulatory requirements for traditional financial transactions, say between banks, and those for virtual asset transactions. And this could incentivize the use of virtual asset for illicit purposes, as they would be subject to less scrutiny. And there's less trust. The absence of the travel rule could undermine trust in virtual assets. Unfortunately, virtual assets started off with quite a bad rap in that the anonymity of wallet addresses and the payments that were being made led to them being known as a bit of the wild, wild west. But now regulators are putting AML regulations in place. It's starting to improve trust, and the travel rule is another step towards improving that trust. And hindrance to institutional adoption. Most virtual asset service providers want virtual assets themselves to be more globally adopted, and without having the travel rule in place, that I say that it's one less rule. The travel rule is there to sort of prevent money laundering, and if you don't have these rules in place, then a lot of trust company businesses and a lot of firms out there aren't going to touch virtual assets. So really, it's putting another rule in place in the hope that virtual assets will be used more globally. So we're now going to go into the challenges of implementing the travel rule. And really, to understand the challenges, you need to understand a little bit about how virtual asset transactions are recorded, which we're going to show on the next slide. Okay, so these are examples of transactions involving Bitcoin and Ethereum. And as some of you may know, transactions for sending Bitcoin from one wallet address to another, the information of those transactions is recorded on what's known as the blockchain, which is a ledger of transactions. But there's very basic information stored on this blockchain, and this information can only be added. It can't be edited or destroyed once it's on the blockchain. So the information that's recorded at the time of transaction is the details of the wallet address that is sending the Bitcoin, the wallet address that's receiving the Bitcoin. It should be stated that wallet addresses are just strings of numbers and letters. There's no personal information attached to a wallet address. So yeah, it's got the wallet address that's sending, wallet address that's receiving, it's got the amount that's being sent, and it's got the date and time of the transaction. There's no facility on the Bitcoin blockchain to add any kind of personal information. On the Ethereum blockchain, which we see on the right-hand side here, it's got the wallet address from at the top and the wallet address to underneath it, the amount that's been sent. It's also got some other information in there. It's got the date and time of the transaction, but at the bottom there is an input data field where you can add data to the blockchain. But that is going to come with its own issue, because if you imagine if you're going to enter someone's personal information, who they are, their potentially their physical address, the blockchain is transparent. Anyone can review the contents of the blockchain with regards to Bitcoin and Ethereum. So anybody would be able to see the private information that was stored in this field on the Ethereum blockchain. So there are privacy and security concerns associated with attaching the sensitive personal information to the virtual asset transaction. If the information were to be stored on the blockchain, it could potentially be accessible to anyone and could be vulnerable to misuse. However, to comply with regulations like the travel rule, virtual asset service providers are required to share this information we spoke about earlier, the sender and receiver information for transactions. This therefore requires a separate system and processes to securely transmit and store the information off the blockchain. And this can be complex and costly to implement. Okay, so there has to be a separate travel rule solution set up. The information can't be stored on the blockchain alongside the transactions as they're recorded on there. So we're going to look at another challenge now, which is travel rule thresholds. Each country, so we looked at the Bank Secrecy Act, and they said that if a payment was over $3,000, then you had to have this other information traveling along with the transfer, sender details, receiver details. The FATF themselves recommended a threshold of payments over $1,000 or euros, but it should be noted that countries can establish their own thresholds or go one altogether. As I mentioned, the Bank Secrecy Act had a threshold of $3,000, and below is an extract from that FATF targeted update in 2023, and it showed some of the thresholds for the different jurisdictions. So 32, the largest proportion, the travel rule applies regardless of the amount. So these jurisdictions have set the value, the threshold at 0. So every transaction from VASP to VASP needs to have travel rule applied to it. And then we've got 21 out of the respondents who have taken FATF's recommendation of 1,000 euros or dollars, and then we've got a couple which are a little bit higher and a couple a little bit lower than that.
I have a quick question. Is
Sure.
there any reason for a country to lower the threshold? Is it like, because you have a slide later on, and I was just I was interested in knowing why a country would say we're going to lower the threshold. Is it just because they feel like they're more of a risk, the country, the jurisdiction itself, or?
Yes, I think that's it. In case
Okay.
there are some countries, some VASPs that are sending, unfortunately, criminals recognise what these thresholds are. And so if the threshold's $1,000, they will send a number of payments for $999 to try and sort of beat the system. And there should be control set up to identify multiple 999 payments, but it's not always the case. So I think by setting the value at 0, it just means that every transaction has to have the travel rule applied to it. So it's just by reducing the threshold, you're increasing the amount of sort of anti-money laundering control.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the next slide, it really is just a global snapshot. So there's 23 jurisdictions that have implemented the travel rule globally so far. And here we've got some different jurisdictions with some different thresholds. If they're a sort of amber or orangey color, it means that they are yet to implement the travel rule. And so Australia is a bit of a surprise. You think that they're quite good with their money laundering prevention, but they still haven't decided on a date to apply the travel rule. But as you can see, there's a lot of different thresholds across the globe. It's really just an example, just to show a snapshot of the sort of global thresholds that are in place. Okay, so another challenge is related to unhosted wallets. Okay, so we went into unhosted wallets in the previous webinar, and it may be, if you want to learn more about sort of AML techniques around unhosted wallets, you can review that webinar at a later date. So an unhosted wallet, also known as a self-custodied or non-custodial wallet, is a type of wallet, cryptocurrency wallet, where the private keys and control of the virtual assets in the wallet are solely in the hands of an individual or a user. It means that the user is responsible for managing their own funds and securing their own funds. And unlike hosted wallets, which are provided by third-party services such as exchanges like Binance or other digital asset service providers, unhosted wallets gives users full control over their assets, but also full responsibility for their security, which can provide greater privacy and control, but also increases the risk of loss if the user mismanages or loses their little cryptocurrency dongle that they've got there. There's no third party to assist with recovery. You can't get a replacement, and your virtual assets are effectively lost. And so it's therefore worth noting that unhosted wallets can pose regulatory challenges, because regulators aren't going to get in touch with individuals who hold unhosted wallets. And FATF themselves have said, that if you have an unhosted wallet and you're going to send funds to another unhosted wallet, then the travel rule doesn't apply to you. But they have said that VASPs that have customers who are sending funds to unhosted virtual asset wallets, there's two things they can do. Either VASPs can consider unhosted wallets to be too high a risk and say, okay, Binance customer, you cannot send your virtual assets to this unhosted wallet. Or they can say, okay, Binance customer, please tell us who is in charge of this unhosted wallet that you want us to send details to. So FATF acknowledges that local jurisdictions may mandate that VASPs transacting with these wallets perform an additional risk assessment, and many jurisdictions like Singapore, Switzerland, and the Netherlands are starting to instruct VASPs to verify the owners of these self-hosted wallets through their customers.
Okay.
And
I have a question.
sorry, yes.
Sorry, I do have one question that's being posed, and what I'll do is I'll just kind of give you a summary of what this person's asking, but maybe we can talk about it more. But I think it relates to this slide, or the answer for them will be in this slide,
Okay.
where you say unhosted wallet. So the question is being asked, is the travel rule applicable in situations where VAST client, so the virtual asset service provider's client,
Yep.
is a casino or merchant, so not another regulated virtual asset service provider, and the transaction is between like the casino's clients and their end users. So in that case, is that kind of like a situation where the VASP might say, we think this transaction is too risky because you're sending it to
an
potentially
unhosted one.
an unhosted wallet, which might be held by, for instance, like a casino client
Yeah.
or a casino or a merchant or something like that. Is that what you're
So
saying there?
yeah, it's the VASP themselves need to risk assess and sort of say whether or not they want to have any dealings with unhosted wallets. It may be that they have said, actually, as a responsible VASP, we're only going to send funds to hosted wallets on other that are on other exchanges, other virtual asset service provider exchanges. That may be what their stance is on sending virtual assets out to other wallet addresses. So it may be, and this is really where sort of global regulation is a bit of an imbalance at the moment, because some places have good AML controls and good recommendations in place, and others have very low AML controls in place. So we're sort of looking at the challenges here and what a VASP expected to do when transacting with unhosted wallets. And we're going to look at the solution, well, some potential solutions to this in a few minutes on this presentation. So hopefully
Okay,
we're
yeah,
able to provide a few more answers.
more clarification. Yeah, okay, thank you.
So the sunrise issue, which was one of the polling questions, and that relates to the global staggering of implementation of the travel rule. So with regards to virtual asset travel rule, recommendation 16 refers to the staggered global enforcement of the travel rule, leading to various stages of compliance among VASPs and subsequent challenges. So as we've looked at the global map, it may be that one VASP in one country has adopted the travel rule, and they want to send funds to a VASP in another country that hasn't adopted the travel rule. So that there's challenges in place there. So the FATF's deadline for jurisdictions to implement the travel rule was supposed to be June 2021, but not all jurisdictions have implemented the travel rule yet, and those that have are at different stages of compliance. So they sort of said initially, it's as soon as practicable, but they did eventually come up with a date. But it's, as we've seen from the statistics, that it's really posed a challenge, and not many jurisdictions have been able to get their VASPs to implement the travel rule yet. And given the borderless nature of the crypto transactions, achieving full compliance with the travel rule becomes a complex task for these virtual asset service providers, particularly those operating in jurisdictions where the travel rule is already enforced, and there may be hurdles in executing or receiving responses to travel rule transfers from counterparts in locations where enforcement is still pending. So if you're obliged to abide by the travel rule and you're sending funds to a virtual asset service provider in a country without it, then that's obviously going to be a challenge for you. And we're going to look at the solutions that are being created around this issue. So they often the VASP often grapple with the premature requests for travel rule data transfers before implementing compliance measures. So it's really who's going to go first. Someone's got to start abiding by the travel rule. And as we've seen, there's quite a few green countries out there that have adopted the travel rule, and they must have travel rule solutions in place, which we'll look at later on. Okay. So how can the challenges be overcome? It is a complex challenge with regards to the sunrise issue, and there is no easy solution. But there are a number of things that virtual asset service providers can do to mitigate the risks, such as work with a travel rule solution provider to help them comply with the travel rule. So as we were stating earlier, there has to be a separate channel through which this personal information is sent and received. It can't be added to the blockchain, the native blockchain itself. So it's going to be a software solution. The travel rule solution is going to be a piece of software that allows VASPs to send this information separately alongside the transaction information. So it won't be on the blockchain, but it'll be through a separate communication challenge. They can conduct due diligence on their counterparty VASPs to ensure that the counterparty VASPs are compliant with the travel rule. And it may be that some VASPs only want to do business with counterparties that are also compliant with the travel rule. And then they need to have a plan in place for how they will handle transactions with counterparty VASPs that are not compliant with the travel rule. Okay. So the next challenge to overcome is that different jurisdictions have different threshold requirements. And what's been set up is industry watchdogs. They're there to harmonise these payment thresholds. And ideally, they would create a single global threshold that would apply to all VASPs. And I think, as we've seen, a lot of the regulators, although FATF said €1,000 or dollars as a threshold, I think a number of them are realising the easiest thing to do is set the threshold at 0. So there hasn't got to be any kind of incompatibility of thresholds. If everyone sets it at 0, everyone has to abide by the travel rule for all transactions, which would make life a lot easier. So the actual solution is through a travel rule software solution that supports multiple payment thresholds. So there are some very smart people out there, software providers, who have produced software that will allow you to identify where the VASPs are and apply the thresholds for certain transactions. And the last point, sorry, apply the travel rule to all transactions regardless of the threshold. If you set it at 0, everyone has to abide by the travel rule for every transaction, and that makes life a lot easier when it comes to the different threshold problem. Okay. So we've mentioned about the problem with not being able to add information immediately alongside the transaction information on the blockchain. Some blockchains have no facility to add anything other than basic transaction information. Ethereum, you can add some information, but then everyone can see that information, meaning that it's a data protection issue. So what was set up was in 2020, the InterVASP working group, which is known as the Joint Working Group for InterVASP Messaging Standards. And that was set up by the Chamber of Digital Commerce, Global Digital Finance, and by the International Digital Asset Exchange Association. It's a big working group. There's over 130 experts nominated both by industry VASPs and other impacted entities, software solution providers, academics, and regulators. So this working group operates independently from the crypto industry itself with the sole purpose of setting up a method by which travel rule can be overcome. And they've set up a standard, the InterVASP messaging standard IVMS 101, which is like a kite mark or a stamp to say that this messaging standard is fit for purpose. And it establishes a universal format for the data that has to be sent between VASPs. It prevents a data model for the messages and defines the data constraints, all of which serve to ensure that there's a consistent and complete data collected prior to transmission between virtual asset service providers. And the travel rules service solution providers and builders have integrated this standard into their solutions. And you'll see a lot of the solutions saying that they are IVMS 101 compliant in their marketing material, meaning that the software either formats or verifies the quality and completeness of messages in accordance with this standard, which goes some way towards a technical solution for the travel rule. However, there's still a number of different travel rule protocols, sort of different software providers in operation, operating in slightly different ways. So there is still some way to go when it comes to standardization of messaging, but they're getting there. So on this page, I just wanted to show you an example of a messaging solution, sort of the flow of data. So this is the Trust solution, which stands for Travel Rule Universal Solution Technology. It's launched in December 2021, and it's a closed network operated by Coinbase. And what they've done is they've got 35 virtual asset service providers as of May 2022. Many of the largest VASPs, such as BitGo, Gemini, etc., they're all part of this Trust network. And to become part of it, the VASP must complete onboarding due diligence and ensure that members meet objective security and privacy and compliance standards. Otherwise, they can't be part of the Trust group solution. So it's a solution to identify transaction counterparties and securely transmit the information between the members. So at the top here, we've got information about the transaction between the VASPs, and then we've got underneath this complex structure by which they've got a database of wallet addresses that the different VASPs are operating, and therefore they're able to communicate on this separate channel on the bottom half of the picture that send the user, the customer PII information between the virtual asset service providers that are part of the Trust network. So how does it work? There's a centralized bulletin board used to identify the correct counterparty first off, allowing an originating VASP to identify a beneficiary VASP, and then there's an encrypted peer-to-peer channel to securely transfer the required travel data from the originating VASP to the beneficiary VASP. So with regards to self-hosted wallets and unhosted wallets, this is only designed to allow VASPs to speak to each other. It doesn't support communication with non-custodial wallets or unhosted wallets, but it does allow members to verify the ownership of a deposit address in the context of the travel rule to ensure travel rule information is sent to the correct party. And what we've got on the next slide here is another what we've got are some working examples. So on this occasion, we have got an example that's produced by Sigma, and there's also other travel rule solution providers out there. Nota Bene have their own travel rule solution provider. There's the travel rule solution as well. So on this Sigma travel rule solution, on the top right, we can see that they've got a filter that will identify whether a wallet address involved in the transaction, the beneficiary, belongs to a VASP or whether it's an unhosted wallet, and you can then choose whether or not you want to send funds to either of those. But what they've also done is, and at that point, they may ask their own customer for details about who controls the self-hosted wallet, as we spoke about earlier. So travel rule in itself is one piece of the solution for reducing the risk of money laundering, proliferation, terrorist financing. And most VASPs should have in place what's called blockchain analytics. Blockchain analytics is another piece of the sort of AML puzzle for solving the puzzle. If we can just go back to the previous slide for a second, that would be great. So, because what we've got here at the bottom half of this are examples of blockchain analytics. And with blockchain analytics, you will put a wallet address into the software and it will risk rate that software and give you evidence of why it might be seen as a high risk. So the one on the bottom left, we've got a risk score of 100 out of 100, and it's telling you that the wallet address was used as part of a ransomware attack. So the wallet address was provided to the victims of a ransomware attack, and the victims were asked to send funds to this wallet address. So that's what blockchain analytics does. It's, as well as looking at the native blockchain, which is transaction and basic wallet information, it applies intelligence from law enforcement groups around the world to these wallet addresses to enable to risk score them. Bottom right, there's another example of a wallet address going in to blockchain analytics and giving a score of 45 out of 100. So there's extra tools on top of the travel rule that are there to prevent virtual assets being used for money laundering.
Okay, I have a quick question.
Yeah, of course.
Because you mentioned ransomware, would this be an indicator that, for instance, if it was the other way around, if it was this person was the sender and this person was the recipient, and they were low and they were high because that address had been used for ransomware, that would be an indicator that they're the cyber attackers receiving those funds as a payment. Is that correct?
So at the bottom here, it would be the case that a criminal who has carried out a ransomware attack is attempting to send virtual assets to an exchange wallet, which has a very low risk score. So if that were the case, and because you can't stop, attempting to clean it by placing it through an exchange. If they did send the money to the exchange, then the exchange would see, their blockchain analytics software should pick this up, and then it should be submitting a SAR in relation to the receiving of these virtual assets, because you can't prevent virtual assets being sent to your wallet. It's impossible to do so. So if this situation takes place, then the VASP themselves should be contacting their local financial intelligence unit and submitting a suspicious activity report with regards to this. Okay.
Interesting.
So on the next page, we should have what a travel rule solution looks like. So this is a software interface from Sigma, and it shows you the information that is gathered at the time of, but before the transaction actually takes place. So we've got the originator virtual asset wallet address, the beneficiary virtual asset address, we've got direction, the value, the time and the date that the transaction would taken place. And we've also got on the top right, which is pretty much the travel rule part of it. So we've got the beneficiary and sort of the sender information being exchanged, and there's obviously been a message sent to the beneficiary VASP, and the sender is awaiting information back from the beneficiary VASP. This solution has also got blockchain analytics built into it, so you're getting a blockchain analysis score for the receiving wallet address, and it's also screening for sanctions as well. And underneath, we've got the counterparty VASP info, so the originator VASP legal name, and on the bottom right, we've got the originator personal information. So we've got Bob Baxter, who's a customer of the sending VASP, and on the bottom right, Alice Andrews, who's the customer of the receiving VASP. Okay. So just sort of finishing really at this point on timescales for adoption. So originally with the Bank Secrecy Act, there was a SWIFT messaging system that was set up. So when the original travel rule was implemented in the 90s, the Sunrise issue was largely resolved within a few years partially through the use of things like SWIFT. It was due to a number of factors, including the fact that the travel was only applicable to a small number of financial institutions at the time, which were mainly banks. There was a high level of cooperation between these banks and financial institutions, and also with regulators as well. So everyone was on board with getting the travel rule implemented, but also the travel rule was relatively simple to implement, as it only required financial institutions to exchange certain information about wire transfers. They didn't have this blockchain, native blockchain issue, a number of other issues we've spoken about, things like unhosted wallets. However, the travel rule for virtual assets, as I say, is more complex to implement than the original travel rule because of the different types of virtual assets and technology used, and the fact that virtual assets are constantly evolving. And the regulatory landscape for virtual assets in itself is still developing, and there's not yet a global consensus on how the travel rule should be implemented. And as a result, this sunrise issue it's likely to take a longer period of time to resolve than the original sunrise issue for the original travel rule. But FATF recognises this, I believe, and they're working with the jurisdictions to address the issue. And as we've seen, some travel rule solutions are already being developed and deployed. So with regards to how long it's going to take, I think it's going to take a number of years for all VASPs to implement the travel rule. But I think it is recognised in Europe, for example, the travel rule is only going to start being enforced December 2024. So VASPs in Europe are still got quite a while to get their travel rule solution in place. But in the meantime, VASPs can mitigate the risks associated with this sunrise issue by working with travel rule solution providers so that they can get up to speed with complying with the travel rule, conduct due diligence on the receiving parties' VASPs to ensure they are compliant with the travel rule, but also have a plan in place of how they will handle transactions with counterparty VASPs and unhosted wallets that are not compliant with the travel rule. So that's it really, the fact that the regulators realise the scale of this challenge. They're not there to really crack the whip. They want you to get the travel rule solutions in place as quickly as possible, but they realise that there are still challenges ahead for virtual asset service providers. And no one wants to be on FATF's grey list as it is. So all VAS are under FATF's watchful eye. Who are under FATF's watchful eye will be looking to implement the solution, travel rule solution, as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a lot of information, and you did that in record time, I think.
I tried to get through it swiftly. There's a lot to get through and a lot of
It
challenges,
is.
and I think there's nothing that you can really miss out. But the fact is that there are solutions that have been created, and some of them are already effective, like the trust system. They are already out there and being used in industry, which is great. And so it's about evolving those solutions and getting them spread out sort of globally for all VAS to be using.
Yeah. And what's your prediction for any jurisdiction that has implemented it? What's your prediction or forecast if a VASP in that jurisdiction does not have it implemented in their system? Because it does require them getting the technology
Yeah,
as
yeah,
well. Do you
absolutely.
think that will
And
be heavy fines, heavy penalties,
I,
loss of
I,
license?
I think, for example, in Cayman, SEMA, the regulator over there, they've got a $0 threshold, and they require VASPs to transmit to SEMA the sort of the travel rule information that is being kept by VASPs. They require it to be submitted to SEMA. So I think things like that, when you're being registered as a VASP in a jurisdiction, the local regulators will look at the travel rule and how you're putting solutions in place. So if you want to set up as a VASP, you'll need to be looking at the travel rule and sort of how you're going to overcome that challenge. So
Okay.
yeah,
And
it's
is that common practice to have the VASP submit the data, even if it's not suspicious, to submit all travel information to the
I,
regulator?
I think regulators are very keen to get as much data from virtual asset service providers as possible because it's an evolving area of the financial industry. I think the more data they get, the more analysis they can carry out. And statistics we've been looking at here from FATF themselves, all that information, although useful to FATF, the local regulators and the local financial intelligence units will love the fact that this data has been provided by virtual asset service providers, as it gives them some data to work on to identify virtual assets and the sort of risks associated with them.
Okay. Okay. And somebody was asking if you could just go over the sunset rule again, and if I may, I might kind of, because I had to learn about it as well. And it to me it was kind of like if I'm trying to make if I'm in the U.S. or if I'm in the U.K. trying to make a phone call to somebody in the U.S., but they're not woken up yet. So in other words, that's why you call it the sunset
Yeah,
issue, don't you? Is because it's
the
this other
sunrise,
jurisdictions or sunrise, yeah, sunrise.
yeah,
Sorry, but the other jurisdiction or the other VASP has not implemented the travel rule on their system yet. So
that's it.
that,
I think the idea is that because the sun has risen over you doesn't necessarily mean that somewhere else in the world the sun is up. The
yes.
sun is yet to rise over there. And similarly with the regulations of virtual assets and the regulation sort of travel rule implementation, there are some jurisdictions that are still in the dark and still seen as sort of high risk when it comes to money laundering, in that they've hardly got any AML regulation in place, and certainly the travel rule is yet to probably even be mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah, I liked the name. It's because I got it almost right away, just from the naming of it, Colleen.
Yeah,
Okay, so a couple of questions, see if I can get
sure.
to these. Um, see, so okay, so I think we answered that one. So that was the one about the casinos. So basically, they're going to have to apply the risk assessment process. So really, the key takeaway here is that if you're not if it's if the exchange is not between two VASP that have both implemented the travel rule, both have the due diligence, you're going to have to do some risk assessment
That's right, yes.
on the
You got
transaction.
Yeah, you've got to decide whether or not you're going to transact with VASPs that have applied the travel rule, yes or no. And similarly with unhosted wallets, are you going to send funds to, as a VASP, are you going to send funds out to unhosted wallets?
hmm
That's for you to
So
decide.
right, so the travel rule does not apply only between VASP. It applies to a VASP regardless of what transaction they're making, whether it's
So
to
yeah,
another VASP or a non-compliant VASP or an unhosted wallet.
yeah, it's there really to get virtual asset service providers to similarly with like the Bank Secrecy Act when it was first set up. The idea is that you've got this personal information that goes between organizations, so you can track who was sending virtual assets between virtual asset service providers. And if it's an unhosted wallet, then there isn't any personal information per se. And the fact that the travel rule isn't applied for unhosted wallet to unhosted wallet transactions, because it's really that if you wanted to be a registered virtual asset service provider, you need to have AML controls in place, and one of them is this travel rule.
Okay, great. And then another question is the travel rule. So you mentioned about the trust. You know, where we're trying
Yes.
to fight the money laundering, ensure that it's legit currency. Do you think the travel rule is going to increase the value of virtual assets in the long run for investment purposes?
Yeah, I think what will happen is there'll be more, it'll lower the risk of virtual asset when it comes to virtual assets. There's already, I think there was a bit of a blanket red rating of virtual assets back in the day. And I think as more regulation is taking place, it's improving sort of the confidence in virtual assets. You've still got an issue with virtual assets with regards to sort of volatility of price of virtual assets, but there's a number of virtual assets out there, such as the USDT, a virtual asset which is sort of pegged to the price of a real asset like the dollar. So the price of a USDT virtual asset will only fluctuate as much as the price of the dollar fluctuates. And those kind of virtual assets, I think, are going to probably be adopted more globally and seen as a quick way of sending funds around the globe. But with things like the trust and blockchain analytics and these AML controls put in place, it'll mean that there should hopefully be a lot more global adoption because the risk will be reduced through the application of these controls.
Okay. And you mentioned the Cygnus. That's a service provider, correct?
So yeah, they're the provider of a travel rule solution. Yeah,
Okay. And are there others?
yeah, absolutely.
Somebody's
There's
asking. Okay, tons.
yeah.
Is
Yeah.
Chain Alice's? Is that one of them?
So what tends to happen is that you will have a travel rule solution provider pairing up with a blockchain analytics provider, and Chainalysis, a lot of people will have heard of with regards to blockchain analytics.
Okay.
So you end up with, I say, sort of a combination of solution providers. So Nota Bene have a travel rule solution which also incorporates blockchain analytics, and they have got TRM Labs providing the blockchain analytics, which is similar to sort of chain analysis. So you end up with this sort of combination of tech companies, one of which is sort of looking to solve the travel rule. They've partnered up with a blockchain analytics firm. So when we looked at the Cigna interface, you saw there was a combination there of the travel rule and the blockchain analytics scoring as well.
Okay, great. And somebody's asking just to clarify that this travel rule applies between VAST even if they're in the same jurisdiction. It's not just international
Yeah, that's right.
transactions.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So that's great. And we're coming top of the hour. So one other question is if you are a VASP user, so maybe you're a business that has international trades and you've kind of resorted or you have an option to send uh, virtual assets. And so to ensure that your transactions do not get, I guess, stopped or refused, you have to confirm that your VASP, your virtual asset service provider, is travel rule compliant, as well as your, let's say, your customer, your vendor, or supplier of goods. They're also compliant. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
you
So
need to
is it?
carry out your due diligence really on if you're going to deal in virtual assets, then and you're going to use a virtual asset service provider. You want to carry out your due diligence on that virtual asset
Okay.
service provider. So on the exchange you're going to be using, you want to do your research. Where are they operating from? Do they have good regulation in that area? It's effectively your what kind of quality money laundering controls are in place in these virtual asset service providers. So yeah, if for example you're a business and you wanted to be able to send virtual assets, so you're a trust company business and you wanted to send virtual assets and you decided that you were going to either get in partnership with Binance or another virtual asset service provider, you just do your due diligence on those providers really and choose the
Okay.
one that fits with what you want.
And one of those ways of doing your due diligence is finding out if they are that IVMS 101 compliant. Is that kind of
Yeah,
a
standard
good
compliant.
green flag?
It's a good question to ask. Yeah, absolutely. When you're carrying out your due diligence and you're asking your questions of the exchange, do you use blockchain analytics? Where are you registered in the world? And have you got this messaging standard in place for? Are you able to handle and adopt the travel rule solution? So yeah, they're good questions to ask when engaging with an exchange.
Okay, great. Okay, I think that's going to be it. I apologize I didn't get to all the questions, but Andy, thank you so much for that. That
No
was
worries.
great. And your contact details in Jersey, Channel Islands are here. You've
Yes.
also got George's. She's in Cayman, and of course anybody can call you. They don't have to be just
Yes.
in those jurisdictions if they're seeking that kind of assistance. I appreciate that.
No,
So
they
again,
can either.
for those who do want the slides, we will send out the slides. I'll send out the instructions on how to get the slides. And sorry, did you have something else to add?
All I was going to say was I'm always keen to engage with anybody interested in virtual assets, be it from just a general sort of learning point of view. If people require any training or just keen to speak about virtual assets, then either my details are on this slide deck or I'm on LinkedIn. If anyone wanted to get in touch to discuss anything, then please feel free to do so.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So let's have a couple little last polls just to make sure. Tom, I hope you're still there. So we just want to kind of ask a couple of questions. We want to make sure that the audience kind of got the information and comprehended it correctly. So this is really your grade, isn't it, Andy? And I think you did a great job.
Oh, cheers, Kimberly.
Um, yeah. So the first question was, oh, sorry, this is the wrong one. That's the threshold requirement in your jurisdiction. So this is, sorry, uh, it's kind of interesting. So some people, the threshold jurisdiction, sorry, I should have asked that one. That's my bad, Tom. I apologize. But you could go ahead and close that one. So that was just asking if you knew your threshold requirement, and 45% are saying, unsure, 23% there's no travel rules implemented yet. So kind of gives us all an idea of where everybody is in this kind of changing landscape. So go ahead and ask the next one, Tom. It is the sunrise issue again question, where we were just kind of asking them to answer that, see if we get a higher score. Yes, I think we are definitely going to get a higher score. Just give that a couple more because that was the one where I can't remember what the score was earlier, but I think we only had about half the people answering it correctly. All right, so let's go ahead and show that. So we are still getting the 61%. So that sunrise issue is still kind of hard for some people to understand. Um,
Yeah.
you can Google it. If you Google it, there's some very good articles. If you are trying to wrap your head around it, that's what I did as well, and I immediately found some very good articles that explained it, and that's how I kind of came up with that explanation of, if you're trying to make a phone call and yet the next country's not, the sunrise hasn't occurred yet, they might not answer the phone. Kind of thing.
Yes,
That's how
quite. Yeah.
I.
Yeah.
And the next question, Tom, is about the challenge for travel rule implementation. You went over all of them. I thought you explained them very well. I thought the blockchain messaging was very interesting, and I might be giving away the answers here, so I won't talk too much. um, because I didn't. It's interesting because I'm doing a lot of research right now on AI. Because when you mentioned the blockchain messaging, and all of a sudden it will become
Yes.
very the information becomes publicly available. I'm doing a lot of research on various AI tools right now, and just kind of seeing, gosh, there's a lot of data privacy risk if
Yes, quite.
everybody just starts opening up and all of a sudden using any of these AI tools. We really need to be careful with any new technologies and making sure that the privacy is stays it's stays there.
Yeah,
It's
there are
yeah.
controls around the privacy. Yeah.
Yes, excellent. Great. Okay, so good answers there. Yeah, 70% are saying,
Excellent.
all of the above, which is true. So you get those
That's
four
great.
big, so great, fantastic. And
Super.
then two more questions to help me, if you don't mind. We
Okay.
have two topics for potential webinar, and this is just for the audience as well. So Tom, if you can ask, the next webinar will be in November, but do you want to hear about the AI stuff, the research that I'm doing, or are you going to prefer sanctions, because there's a lot going on still with sanctions and AI, as if we don't have enough on our plates as compliance professionals. Okay, fantastic. I think AI is going to win there, so you can go ahead and close that down. Yeah. So okay, so I will cover AI and its impact on AML compliance next month. And for those who are worried it's going to take our jobs, my preliminary research, I am not concerned about that at all. So don't worry, you can sleep well at night for the next month. But I will show you some AI tools that I think are going to be, they're going to be very helpful tools for the compliance industry. So stay tuned and do join us in November for that. And final poll question, sorry to take up everybody's time here, but we have been asked to consider hosting a conference, an in-person conference. We are looking at either Miami or Palm Beach. It'll be next year. And if I could just get some quick information to see if there's a real uh, demand for it. So yeah, so we've got, so right now just over 50% are saying a maybe, depends on date and price. 12% yes, 32% unlikely. Okay, that's helpful. I appreciate that very, very much, and I will take this to those who are suggesting it, and we'll assess the demand there. And I'll just finish up too. There was a couple of webinars ago. I issued a survey, and I asked everybody, what is your biggest compliance challenge currently? And these are the results. I thought you might find this very interesting. The number one by far answer was hiring and retaining compliance staff. Now, these were just written in topics. I did not give any kind of, drop down menus or anything. I just said, just tell me what your biggest challenge is. And hiring and retaining compliance staff right now is the number one challenge. Assessing technology, especially AI related tools, that's also a big challenge for everybody. Training, role specific training and interactive training is also big demand. Keeping up with challenges and demands. Of course, everybody's facing overwhelm and burnout. That's probably the reason why retaining compliance staff is a challenge. Managing the costs, getting getting boards to approve budgets. You're going to have to learn, if you want new tools, you're going to have to learn how to speak return on investment and efficiencies and savings and things like the cost savings for the company as a whole. And of course, reducing the onboarding friction that your customer or client experiences. That was also a big on the list. So there were some others, but I thought this was very interesting, and things that that kind of survey result does help me identify where we need to focus our topics and guests as well. And so thank you very much. And upcoming events. So first of all, certificates will go out in about an hour. The next webinar date will be announced, and I will cover the AI topic. And somebody was asking, please, both sanctions and AI. I will also get somebody on the sanctions topic as well. And upcoming events. So there is a CIFA, that's a Cayman Islands Fund Administrators Association. They asked me to please promote their course the 25th and 26th of October. You can go to their website. It's here. I'll be in London in mid-November. I'm attending and speaking, or I'm a panelist at the AMLP Financial Crimes Conference in mid-November. So if you are in London and you would like to meet me, please shoot me an email or connect with me on LinkedIn, and let's try and connect and have a coffee at least. And also there's going to be an AML compliance officers training in November, also in Cayman. And I'll also be sending out some information about an open demo. That's where if anybody's interested in our solution, they can just kind of join, listen in, and just determine if it's right for them. And Andy, any conferences or events that you're hosting?
So I was just asking Georgia, who was on that list, who's based in Cayman. She is
Mhm.
presenting at the Cayman Islands Compliance Association on November the 16th, covering the new rule on corporate governance. So if you've got an interest in
Okay.
corporate governance and you're in Cayman, November the 16th, there's a presentation going on at the Cayman Islands Compliance Association.
Okay, I might reach out to Georgia then, see if I can get a link to how people can register, so I can send that in the follow-up email too.
Great.
And if any of the audience members knows of great conferences or events or training sessions that you think others, please do. We want to be a kind of a resource for everybody. So do send that information to me, and I can always just put them in, like, kind of here's some resources available there. So thank you very much. I realize we've gone on a little bit more. Andy, thank you again so much for explaining. Again, as I said before in the other webinar that you hosted, you explained very difficult and complex and technical concepts so well. I mentioned before that I can understand why you are a great expert witness, because as a layperson, I don't play around with Bitcoin or virtual assets, or I don't have a VASP, I don't have an unhosted wallet, but I feel like I understand it a lot
Oh,
better
that's
now.
great. Thank you,
And
Kimberly.
so,
That's nice
so
feedback.
I can speak for myself, and it looks like some of the comments, a lot of people are saying thank you very much as well. So if
Oh, thank
anybody
you
wants
for
to,
listening.
yes, so thank you. So if there's anybody out there, we are putting together our calendar for 2024, and if you are interested in being a guest on a particular topic, please do reach out to me. There's my email, kimberly@silocompliance.com. If you would like to join our partner program, we are standardizing that and about to release information about that. Elias, he's our head of partnership, so you can reach out to him. And if you're looking for a solution for your compliance, and please do reach out to Tom Gardner. And I think that's it. Like I said, we'll also be sending out information about how to get copies of the slides in the follow-up, and I'll send information about the next webinar topic. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Anti-money laundering compliance and customer and vendor onboarding involves multiple processes that must be done correctly and by the right people in the most efficient way. The tasks include gathering customer and vendor ID and verification documents, screening against sanctions and politically exposed persons lists, analyzing any reputational risk, periodic monitoring to assess any changes and updating due diligence, and staff training on money laundering, terrorist financing, bribery and corruption awareness and risks, as well as keeping them up to date on your policies and procedures and new regulatory requirements. In addition to the onboarding processes being strictly followed and documented, management must have access to critical compliance metrics and information to steer the company through regulatory waters and mitigate customer and other risks. With Silo Compliance System, these obligations become much more efficient. With Silo, your staff can enter the customer's information and upload due diligence documents and any other documents that you require. Key information entered about your customer automatically calculates a risk score, a calculation using a risk-based approach determined by you at initial implementation of Silo. In addition, if you have screening enabled, when the customer's name is first entered into Silo, the name is checked against sanctions, politically exposed persons lists, and adverse media. You'll see results of screening immediately and can review any potential hits right away. And with screening enabled, your customers and vendors are continuously monitored for any sanctions advisories, helping you get ahead of any potential reputational risks. No company is too small to benefit from using Silo. Even if your onboarding processes seem under control today, if one key staff member becomes unavailable or there is any increase in your customer portfolio, compliance with strict onboarding and review processes can quickly overwhelm a small company and put you at risk. Plus, implementing Silo can reduce the need to hire additional staff to manage compliance obligations and reduce your risk of non-compliance regulatory penalties and continued inspections. No one goes through an inspection or audit with great ease, but several users have reported that their inspections went more smoothly and with Silo they had improved outcomes. Reach out to us today to schedule a demo of Silo.